Hi there, and welcome to our latest edition of Money Talks, where we take a look at all aspects of the rural economy as it affects you in the ag sector. How will New Zealand cash in on the lucrative ruling by the World Trade Organization that will let kiwi apples into Australia, and plenty more countries too, after being frozen out for almost a century? What's up with global grain prices as the crisis in Russia deepens, with the worst drought in 130 years? And is there any hope at all for the cash-starved investors of allied farmers, or is receivership just around the corner? All this and much, much more coming up. But first, equities were down last week with weaker economic data from around the globe. What's the fallout here in New Zealand? Let's go to ASB rural economist James Shortall. James, thanks for being with us.
Good to be here. Not
a great week for equities. What's going on?
US equities were down, and it comes back down to what's happening in the US economy. And some of the data out last week wasn't that strong, especially the employment data wasn't as strong as what many people were anticipating it to be. So that has seen US equities down, and of course back here it has effect on our currency.
How's the New Zealand dollar holding up right now against the greenback?
Yeah, over the past, on Tuesday night, then we have actually fallen against most currencies and sort of trading under 73 cents. But over the past week, we've actually spent most of our time above 73. And it's interesting that, you know, the US economy, when we have seen weakness, then the New Zealand dollar has fallen against the US. But it's interesting that we have actually still been fairly strong. And I guess it comes back down to, you know, the US economic data hasn't been quite as weak as what people were suggesting it could have been, and it's not too bad just yet, so that's why we're still relatively strong.
And of course now we know that the US Federal Reserves are actually going to go ahead and print some more money, but not as much as we expected. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think the important part is that the US Fed have made this announcement. It's the first time in 12 months that they've announced further stimulatory measures. They've obviously assessed that the US economy is slowing down a little bit. The growth at least is slowing down. They're going to take the necessary measures to make sure that they continue to grow. And it was actually, you've been asking me the last few weeks about whether the US economy would go into double dip. There's been a bit of talk from one of the Federal Reserve banks, the regional banks, that you know there is potential for the US economy to go into a double dip. So that's interesting, and the Fed's making it quite clear that they are going to take all the necessary measures to avoid that.
How are we doing against the euro and the pound?
We've actually come back against both of those currencies in the past week. Our unemployment figures last week had an impact on that. We actually fell about 0.5% against the New Zealand dollar last week, and against the pound then we're back under 46p. We've actually pulled back our forecast a little bit against the pound. We're still going to stay well above 40p, but you know, perhaps we won't stick up above 46 for too much longer, which I'm sure sheep farmers in New Zealand are going to be breathing a bit of a sigh of release, but there's still going to be some pain there.
Now tell me, something interesting happening with Whole Foods. You think that it speaks to us. What's going on? Yeah,
I actually find you know, following Whole Foods has been quite interesting for just global food, and of course in the US market, which is very important. Whole Foods is they retail organic foods and sustainable foods, grass-fed beef, you know, all the foods that we produce here in New Zealand, as opposed to some of the other retail or the supermarkets in the US like a Kroger, who are just, you know, mass market supermarkets. And it's been interesting through the recession. Then Whole Foods have seen sales growth of about 8 to 9% versus Kroger, who are, you know, mass market. They've sort of been 1 to 2%. So you know, the wealthier clientele that want sustainable foods have still been demanding strong growth. And last week Whole Foods said that they're also susceptible to recession, and some of their demand factors have drifted off, and their profits have drifted off over the last quarter too.
Likewise, fascinating story out of Dallas, Texas, a company called Dean's that is actually the largest dairy processing company in the United States. They're seeing that shoppers, when it comes to buying milk, their habits are really changing.
Yeah, and they, I think it's interesting to note that towards the end of the month, when the money starts running out, they start buying less milk, and that's when they really see their sales tail off. So, I mean, all of those factors, you know, sort of point towards what's happening in the US market. You know, higher income sort of global industry or global economy, and you know, people are hurting, and you know, it tells a lot about what's happening in the US economy and what's happening with food globally for the higher end products.
Here at home, of course, we had bad news on the unemployment figures. Did they get the earlier surveys wrong that were so optimistic?
Yeah, well, I'd like to think that they didn't get those wrong, but you know, with the numbers jumping around a little bit, then it does make you wonder. You know, over the first quarter, then we saw unemployment fall from just over 7% down to 6%, and now all of a sudden we've bumped back up to 6.8%. So you know, things are all over the show. It doesn't give us a clear steer as to how the New Zealand economy is going. I think you know, the headline figures were a bit shocking, but some of the more positive features of that came out of the labour force survey was that more people have been taken onto full-time employment from part-time employment. So you know, it hasn't been big numbers, but I guess the positive factor is that businesses are starting to feel a little bit more confident about the future. And
interesting, rural job numbers are up. How do you account for that?
Well, I think last year, then when we had the forecast from Fonterra of a $4.55 payout, then there were a lot more owners that got back out into the milk shed, and they were looking to cut some costs. If someone left and they weren't going to replace them, they wanted to make sure that they were going to be sustainable through that season. And now all of a sudden, you know, we've got a pretty good outlook. Even though prices have dropped recently, then the outlook for dairy for the season is going to be much higher than long term. And you know, I'd say people will probably start hiring again.
Talking about dairy, let's look at Fonterra. Are they likely to have another revision downward for the payout?
Well, we're picking a revision down. We've seen the prices drop significantly over the past few months. Since their announcement in May, then both the currency and powder prices or international commodity prices have moved unfavourably for Fonterra. So we think you know, there's going to need to be a revision. When that's going to happen, who knows? It's probably you know, our forecast is suggesting about $6 at the moment, give or take, say 20 cents. There's so much movement going on at the moment. We're going to need to see an increase in prices to sort of stay at the 660 level at the moment.
We'll see how you pick it in the weeks coming up. Thanks, James. More on the global grain crisis after the break and what it means for us here at home as we're joined by Jeff Mathews of Spicers. But first, a question for you in our Farmers Facts and Figures quiz. When it comes to foreign ownership, which top 5 countries have bought up New Zealand farmland in the past 5 years? You might be surprised. The answer right after the break, so stay with us. Welcome back to Money Talks. Just before the break, we asked you which top 5 countries have bought up New Zealand farmland in the past 5 years. The answer, the United Kingdom, Italy, the United States, Israel, and Australia. Moving on now, Russia's prime minister has put a ban on wheat exports because of devastating droughts and fires that have destroyed 20% of its wheat crop. We've already seen panic buying on international markets. Joining us now is Jeff Mathews of Spicers. We're going to ask him what his take is on the global grain crisis coming out of Russia. What do you think, Jeff?
Well, I mean, as you say, it's the worst drought in 130 years. And, I mean, if you look at where Russia was 10 years ago, they were basically a grain importer because they couldn't actually feed themselves. So they have developed in the last 10 years into an exporter. They basically export to North Africa and Middle East. And right now, I mean, there's one company we'll talk about in a minute. They're anticipating their grain crops down 45%, which is way worse than some of the other surveys I've seen.
Global prices for wheat have now rallied to 2-year highs. Are you picking it's going to go higher?
Possibly. But
James,
when you get that shortage, you know, you get big spikes like we've seen in the oil market in the past.
James, what are you picking?
Yeah, I think prices have actually come down over the past few days. They spiked up till last Thursday. Then that's when the prices really spiked up after the announcement came through. Then Friday on the US markets they fell again. They've eased again sort of over the past few days. So I think there was a bit of a knee-jerk reaction last week when this all did come through. But we can't lose sight that grain prices have actually been increasing right through over the past 2 months. So they've really got a good steam on the last week, but they have been increasing for a while.
And what's the fallout going to be here for our farmers?
Yeah, I think it should be positive for farmers here. You know, there's talk that Australia's, you know, that Australia, remember, is one of the only major southern hemisphere producers of grain. So they could fill some of the gap. That could have positive flow-on effects here in New Zealand already. You know, on the Australian Stock Exchange, then the futures have increased a bit, but I'm by no means expecting to see big rebounds. Grain prices here in New Zealand have been pretty low over the past 12 months, and you know we should see an easing off those lows, but you know, $500-600 a tonne, you know, it's a way off yet. Can we expect dairy commodities to continue to rise? I think you know, they have been falling. So the fact that grain prices have increased is good news for us here in New Zealand. You know, when you look at the Europeans and the Americans, and they feed a lot of grain, they feed a lot of corn, and of course when wheat prices are going up, then corn prices also go up. So yeah. It makes it much harder for them. This year they've actually they've been able to produce a little bit more milk because grain prices were lower 2 months ago. Milk prices were high, so their margins were good. All of a sudden that starts to become eroded when those grain prices are high. So we might see a bit of a change in supply over the next few months, and you know, it should be good for our dairy producers here. Jeff, where's the excess wheat going to come from in the world?
Basically, you'd have to say the US is the only other major supplier. I mean, it is the biggest exporter of wheat, soya bean and those kind of products. There's nobody else out there apart from Australia that, you know, can produce that shortfall.
A lot of it, of course, comes from Canada, but they've had terrible problems with flooding.
Yeah, exactly.
I think the important thing to note is that we've had a couple of seasons now where grain supplies have been really strong, and there's a lot of grain in silos around the world, and there's a lot of inventory. So I think, you know, we're going to see production a little bit lower in some of these major producing areas, but that's going to be filled with surpluses from previous years. There's not really going to be an issue out of that. The big issue is going to be coming through to next season. If you know, in Russia, then there's no moisture in the soil, then their winter wheat is going to be down. That makes a big part of their production. So you know, if next season's poor again in terms of supply, then that's going to have big effects. But right now, the downward stretch for Russian productions, I don't think it's going to have a big effect on exactly you know, a big shortage of grain globally. Well, we know with all the farms in Russia, they're changing like everywhere else in the world, much more corporate. Jeff, you've got an interesting story.
Well, yeah, there's a Swedish company called Black Earth Farming that started in 2005, and with the relaxation in farming and also subsidies in Russia, they've been allowed to buy 330,000 hectares of land in an area bordering on the Ukraine and Russia. It's called Black Earth region, and that region in itself is about half the size of Germany. I mean, we're talking a massive amount of land. So they own 330,000 hectares. They've been farming it for about 5 years, and they've got about 180,000 hectares in production. Basically wheat, barley, sunflower seeds, rapeseed. But at the moment, it takes 2 or 3 years to bring some of that land into production. They're levelling the land. One of the biggest problems they have now is that they're coming on stream with production is they don't have enough infrastructure. So they're having to build silos to store the grain, and they've got issues getting the grain to market. So it's one of those problems of an underspend in infrastructure in Russia for, you know, 50, 60 years.
Jeff, meantime, a big kiwi fruit company here in New Zealand, Global Hort, has just done a huge deal in China. Talk to me about that.
Well, I don't know a lot about the detail, but I'm aware through friends that they've been looking to develop orchards in China for red and gold kiwi fruit. So.
Correct. They say there's going to be 600 hectares planted over the next 5 years. One of the things that they're really keen on sharing, of course, is research and development. Is this the way of the future for a lot of agribusiness in New Zealand? Do we have to be thinking about this more?
I think that's a good way for us to go. We, you know, we're a country. We've got limited resources in terms of land. There's only so much more land that we can produce food products on. If we look outside of New Zealand, then we've got a lot of knowledge, a lot of expertise in some of these areas, and we can grow our market and grow our capability and grow New Zealand's net worth by exporting our expertise into some of these markets, and that's potentially